The year was 732 AD, and the world trembled beneath the hooves of an unstoppable force. For nearly a century, the armies of Islam had swept across continents like wildfire, from the burning sands of Arabia to the green hills of Iberia, crushing empires that had stood for centuries. The Caliphate, vast and zealous, saw no borders, only the will of God and the promise of expansion. To the east, the Persians had fallen. To the south, the great cities of North Africa bowed. And now, to the north, a new prize awaited the lands of the Franks. The last barrier between the Islamic world and the heart of Christian Europe. The conquests had been swift and merciless. The Visigothic kingdom of Spain had fallen like a house of cards after the fateful Battle of Guadalete in 711. The armies of the Umayyad Caliphate poured through Iberia, led by fierce generals who carried both sword and scripture. Among them rose one name, Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiq, a commander both disciplined and ambitious. To his men, he was the embodiment of destiny, the one chosen to bring the faith to the lands beyond the Pyrenees, to conquer the cold world of the Franks and open the gates to all Europe. By the time the crescent banners reached southern Gaul, towns fell without resistance. The Muslim cavalry, swift, silent, and deadly, swept through Bordeaux, burning, looting, and spreading fear among Christian lords. To them, this was not merely conquest. It was jihad, a divine duty, a holy march ordained by the heavens themselves. The locals spoke in whispers of riders who came at dawn, striking from the mist like phantoms. The sound of hooves was enough to send villages fleeing into forests. Yet amid the panic, one figure rose from the ashes of fear: Charles Martel, the mayor of the Palace of Austrasia, not a king, not a crowned ruler, but a warrior whose hands were calloused from decades of battle and whose mind was sharper than any blade. Known as the Hammer, Charles had spent years uniting the fractured Frankish territories, forging warriors out of farmers and loyalty out of chaos. He understood something the lords of Europe had long forgotten: that survival required unity, and faith alone could not stop a cavalry charge. As news of the advancing Muslim army spread, Charles began to gather his forces. He did not call upon mighty kings or grand armies, for there were none left who could answer. Instead, he summoned the warriors of the north, hardened men from the valleys and forests, men who fought not for glory but for the soil beneath their feet. Each man brought his own weapon, his own horse, his own vengeance. They were the last shield between civilization and conquest. But to the Umayyad general, the Franks were nothing more than a minor obstacle, a barbarian rabble in the cold lands of the north. Al-Rahman's scouts reported that the enemy was poorly equipped and scattered. He had every reason to believe that his cavalry, veterans of Syria and Andalusia, would crush them with ease. His campaign was not merely a military endeavor. It was a message to the world. The crescent would rise above the cathedrals of the Franks just as it had over the temples of Egypt and the palaces of Persia. When the two armies finally approached each other near the small town of Tours, the air grew thick with silence and smoke. The Franks had chosen their ground well, a plateau surrounded by forest, rough and uneven terrain that blunted the charge of horses. Charles knew his men could not outcharge or outrun the Umayyads, but they could outlast them. He ordered his men to form a dense wall of shields and spears, shoulder to shoulder, unyielding as stone. This was not an army of knights or nobles. It was a wall of flesh and faith. For 7 days, the two forces watched each other across the mist-covered plains. Each night, the fires of the Muslim camp flickered like a sea of stars. Their banners glowed red and gold in the torchlight, their chants rising into the heavens. In the Frankish camp, silence reigned. The only sound was the sharpening of blades and the whisper of prayers. Many among them had never faced such an enemy. Riders dressed in silk, armed with curved blades that shone like moonlight, carrying relics of a faith foreign and fierce. The tension was suffocating. The Franks had never faced such numbers. Reports spoke of nearly 70,000 Umayyad soldiers, compared to only 30,000 Franks. To any observer, it seemed madness. The Franks stood like lambs before the slaughter. But Charles was no fool. He had studied his enemy, their speed, their patterns, their arrogance. He knew that to survive, his men must not break, no matter how furious the charge. When the first dawn broke over the battlefield, a cold mist clung to the earth. Al-Rahman gave the signal. The cavalry surged forward, their cries piercing the air. The ground shook beneath the thunder of hooves. The crescent banners snapped in the wind, and the sun glinted off countless blades. The Franks waited still, silent, statues carved in iron. Then came the impact. The clash was deafening. The Muslim cavalry struck the Frankish line like a tidal wave. Spears splintered, shields cracked, men screamed, horses fell. But the Frankish line held, like a fortress of flesh and oak. They absorbed the shock, inch by inch. Every time a horse broke through, a dozen axes came down. Charles himself fought among them, his hammer rising and falling, his presence steadying the ranks. The battle raged from morning till dusk, neither side willing to yield. By sunset, the field was littered with bodies, both Christian and Muslim, tangled in death. The air reeked of blood and smoke. Still, neither side claimed victory. Yet the Franks had done the impossible. They had survived the first day. As night fell, Charles ordered his men to remain silent. No fires, no movement. The Umayyads, on the other hand, retreated to their camp, confident they would finish the Franks at dawn. But during that silent night, something unexpected happened. Scouts reported that looters from the Umayyad ranks had broken discipline, abandoning their posts to plunder the spoils of previous raids, including the massive camp filled with gold, women, and slaves captured from Bordeaux. When dawn came, Charles seized his moment. He ordered a feigned retreat, a tactic to lure the enemy into disarray. As the Umayyad lines broke apart, chaos spread. In the confusion, al-Rahman tried to rally his men but was struck down, his death shattering the army's morale. What had begun as a crusade of destiny turned into a desperate rout. By evening, the fields of Tours were silent again, except for the crows. The Franks stood weary but unbroken. Before them lay the corpses of thousands, the remnants of a world that had nearly conquered all. Charles Martel, the hammer, had turned the tide. He had not only saved his people, but possibly the entire continent. Historians would later debate the magnitude of the victory. But one truth remained. Had the Franks fallen that day, nothing would have stood between the armies of Islam and the gates of Rome. The wind blew cold across the fields. The fires of conquest had been extinguished not by kings or empires, but by the resolve of 30,000 men who refused to kneel. The battlefield of Tours was silent now. Only the wind spoke. But within that silence, something greater than war itself had changed. The world, for the first time in a century, had seen the tide of conquest turn back. As dawn rose over the charred plains of Gaul, the full magnitude of what had happened began to settle over the survivors. The field was littered with broken spears, torn banners, and the pale faces of the fallen. Ravens circled above, black wings cutting through the morning mist like omens of what was lost and what was saved. The Franks, bloodied and exhausted, stood among the dead with the numb disbelief of men who had outlasted destiny. For 7 brutal days and nights, they had defied one of the greatest military forces on earth. The Umayyad Caliphate, whose armies had crushed Byzantines and Persians alike, had been stopped, not by empires, not by walls of stone, but by the will of a single man and the faith of 30,000. It was not victory born of glory, but of endurance, a grim, unrelenting refusal to die. But victory is never clean. Among the heaps of the dead lay both Christian and Muslim alike, men who had believed equally that God was on their side. The survivors would tell stories that blurred the line between miracle and madness. Some swore they saw angels among the smoke, standing beside the Frankish line. Others claimed to have heard whispers in Arabic, calling them to surrender before the final charge. Perhaps both were true, for on that day, faith itself had been tested in blood. Charles Martel moved among the bodies in silence. His armor was dented, his hammer stained with the grime of battle. To his men, he was no longer just a leader, he was the savior of Christendom. But to Charles himself, this victory felt more like survival than salvation. He knew this was not the end of war, it was the beginning of a longer struggle, one that would define the soul of Europe for centuries. The Muslim forces that survived fled south, retreating across the Pyrenees back into a land. What had once been an unstoppable flood had now become a retreating tide. Yet even in defeat, their influence remained vast. The Islamic world still stretched from the Indus River to the Atlantic Ocean, its scholars and warriors shaping the destiny of nations. The fall at Tours did not destroy the caliphate, but it contained it, marking the invisible border where East and West would forever collide. For the Franks, the battle changed everything. In one night, Charles Martel had become more than a general, he had become a legend. Bards sang of the hammer of the Franks, the man who stood between Europe and the Crescent. His enemies feared his discipline, his allies envied his command. But few understood the weight that now rested upon him. The victory had united the Franks, but it had also awakened new ambitions for power, for legitimacy, for empire. Back in Damascus, the heart of the Umayyad Caliphate, the news of the defeat spread like wildfire. It was not just a military loss, it was a spiritual wound. For nearly a century, the Muslim armies had marched undefeated, believing their expansion divinely ordained. To be stopped by a mere band of northern barbarians challenged everything they believed about destiny. The caliph's court grew silent. Chroniclers wrote cautiously of the event, some even omitting it entirely, unwilling to give voice to failure, but whispers persisted that Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafar, their fallen commander, had been betrayed by greed and disobedience, that discipline had broken in the final hours of the battle, and that divine favor had turned away because of pride. Whether truth or rationalization, the story spread among the faithful. God had tested them, and they had faltered. In Europe, however, the tale grew into myth. Christian monks would later call it the moment when the cross held firm against the crescent. Chroniclers of the Frankish kingdoms wrote of divine intervention, of holy visions that guided Charles Martel's hand, but beneath those words of faith lay the harsher truth that it had been strategy, terrain, and discipline that had saved them. Charles had understood what others had not, that the Umayyad cavalry, though deadly, could not maneuver in the narrow and forested lands of Gaul. He had turned nature itself into his ally. Yet, as the bodies were buried and the banners gathered, Charles faced a new reality. the political storm that awaited him. He had fought not as a king, but as a mayor of the palace, a servant entitled to the weak Merovingian monarchs who still clung to their thrones. His power had grown immense, but legitimacy was still out of reach. The nobles of Gaul now looked to him as their protector, their general, their ruler in all but name. The seeds of a dynasty had been planted, one that would one day give rise to Charlemagne, the greatest of Frankish emperors. But peace was not to follow. For years after the battle, the borders remained unstable. Muslim raiding parties continued to cross the mountains, testing the strength of the new frontier. Charles spent the next decade fortifying the southern defenses, rebuilding towns, and training armies. He forged alliances with the church, knowing that divine favor was as valuable as the sword. The papacy, in turn, began to see the Franks not as rough warriors, but as the chosen defenders of Christendom. It was this alliance that would later shape the medieval world, the union of sword and faith, of warrior and priest. In the shadows of Tours, the foundations of medieval Europe were laid. But victory carried its own darkness. The battle had unleashed a wave of zealotry on both sides. In the Christian lands, the victory was seen as proof of divine preference, that God had chosen Europe as his domain. Across the Mediterranean, the Caliphate would double down on its own conviction, turning inward, focusing on consolidation and the flourishing of culture and knowledge within its vast empire. Thus began a quiet war, not of armies, but of ideas. While Europe rebuilt under the hammer of Charles, the Islamic world entered a golden age of science, philosophy, and art. Baghdad rose as a city of brilliance. Cordoba became a beacon of light in the dark ages of the West, and scholars from Damascus to Cairo wrote treatises that would later guide Europe itself out of ignorance. The battle at Tours may have halted one expansion, but it did not halt the flow of influence. Through trade, translation, and knowledge, the East continued to shape the West, in a strange twist of fate. The two civilizations that clashed on the blood-soaked plains of Tours would become mirror images, one defined by faith, the other by survival. Charles Martel's descendants would continue his mission, forging the Carolingian Empire and crowning emperors who saw themselves as defenders of the Christian world. Meanwhile, the Caliphate would evolve, transforming from conquerors to custodians of human knowledge. But to the men who had fought and bled at Tours, such future glories meant nothing. They returned to their villages scarred and silent. For them, the memory of that day was not legend, it was horror. The screams of dying horses, the smoke, the sound of steel against flesh. Many never spoke of it again. For all the songs sung in the halls of kings, war remained what it always had been, a thing of ghosts. Still, the ripples of their stands spread far and wide. Centuries later, historians would look back and call it the battle that saved Europe. Some would argue it was exaggerated, that the Umayyads had no real intention of conquering beyond the Pyrenees. Others would insist that if Tours had fallen, the story of the West itself would have been rewritten. Perhaps both are true. What cannot be denied is that the world after 732 was not the same as before. In the shadow of victory, Charles Martel forged something far more powerful than a battlefield triumph. He forged identity. Europe, once fragmented and tribal, now saw itself as one thing: Christian, Western, and defiant. It was a seed that would grow into centuries of crusades, kingship, and empire. And yet, history is cruelly ironic. For while Charles became known as the Hammer, crushing his enemies to protect the faith, his descendants would one day seek alliances with the very people he fought. Traders from the Frankish kingdoms would travel to Muslim lands, learning from their scholars, borrowing their architecture, even their numbers, the very Arabic numerals that Europe still uses today. The Battle of Tours was, in truth, not the end of a war, but the beginning of a long, complicated relationship between two worlds bound by conflict and curiosity alike. Then the chronicles of time. It stands not only as a clash of armies, but as a moment when the world itself decided what kind of civilization it would become. In the cold silence after Tours, the earth kept its secrets. The battle was over, but the echo of it would haunt the world for 1,000 years. History, it seemed, had shifted its course, and from the blood of 30,000 Franks, a continent's destiny was forged. The chronicles of the time spoke in reverence, some even in fear, of what had transpired on that nameless field near Tours. To the men who fought, it was simply survival, a desperate stand against annihilation. But to the generations that followed, it became legend. The story of how the hammer of the Franks broke the tide of Islam was told in every monastery, every cathedral, and every court of Europe. Monks inked it into the sacred texts of history, often with trembling hands, for in their minds, that day was the day God had drawn a line across the earth, dividing the realms of the cross and the crescent. Charles Martel, though hailed as a hero, did not seek the crown his people begged him to take. Perhaps he understood that kingship was too fragile, too mortal. Power, he knew, came not from coronation, but from control. He ruled as mayor of the palace, wielding more authority than any Merovingian king. His was not the splendor of gold and silk, but of discipline and command. He trained armies, fortified borders, and rebuilt towns shattered by war. While Europe celebrated him as the savior of Christendom, Charles prepared for the next storm because he knew history never rested. Across the mountains, in Al-Andalus, the surviving generals of the Umayyad army licked their wounds. The loss of Abd al-Rahman al-Ghafiq had left a void, but not despair. For even in defeat, their civilization burned brightly. Cordoba and Seville would soon become centers of learning, places where poets, physicians, and astronomers flourished under the light of the crescent moon. The battle at Tours may have halted their advance, but not their greatness. If the sword had been stopped, the mind had not. And so began a silent conquest of another kind, through knowledge, art, and wisdom that would one day reshape even the lands of the Franks. In time, Europe forgot the details of the battle, but never the myth. The victory became a pillar of Christian identity, cited by kings and popes alike as proof of divine favor. When the Crusades began centuries later, preachers invoked the spirit of Tours, reminding their soldiers that they fought for the same cause as Charles Martel, to defend Christendom from the East. The hammer's shadow reached across generations, echoing in the war cries of knights who would march toward Jerusalem, believing themselves heirs to his faith and fury. But with myth comes distortion. The truth of Tours, that it was not holiness but human will that saved Europe, faded beneath layers of sanctified legend. The church seized the story, polishing it into a tale of divine intervention. The political rulers of the Franks, now calling themselves the Carolingians, would inherit that myth to justify empire. Charles's son Pepin, the Short, would seize the throne outright, ending the line of puppet kings. And his grandson, Charlemagne, would build upon that foundation to forge an empire that would once again unite most of Western Europe, the Holy Roman Empire. Thus, from the blood-soaked soil of Tours grew, not just victory, but empire. The hammer that had once struck in defense now forged the future. And yet, beneath the glory, a question lingered. What if Tours had ended differently? What if Al-Rahman had not fallen? Would Europe have embraced a different destiny, one blended with the culture, science, and enlightenment of the Islamic world? Would the Dark Ages have been shorter, the Renaissance earlier? History is cruel in its silence. It tells us only what happened, never what might have been. Charles Martel died in 741, 9 years after the battle. There were no grand monuments at first, no marble statues. He was buried quietly in the Basilica of St. Denis, his tomb simple, as if he knew that legend requires no gold. But his legacy outlived marble. In the centuries to come, as kingdoms rose and fell, his name endured like an iron echo. Martel, the hammer, the man who turned back the tide. Yet, for all the reverence, his victory was not without cost. The myth of saving Europe hardened the walls between East and West, between the world of Islam and Christendom. Suspicion grew where curiosity might have blossomed. Trade and learning would continue, but always beneath the watchful eyes of fear. The world that might have been a world of shared discovery remained just beyond reach, lost to the wounds of pride and blood. Still, something in the story of Tours transcends faith or faction. It is the story of defiance itself, of ordinary men who stood against the impossible. The Franks at Tours were not saints or prophets. They were farmers, blacksmiths, and peasants, hardened by hunger and war. Their shields were wooden, their armor crude, and yet they held, not because they were chosen, but because they refused to break. In that, they mirrored every generation that would face annihilation and stand unyielding before it. For centuries, Europe would measure its courage against the memory of Tours. When the Vikings came, kings evoked the hammer. When the Mongols thundered across the steppes, monks prayed for another Charles. Even in the age of gunpowder, when empires stretched across oceans, the name Martel whispered in the chronicles of nations, a reminder that destiny is not granted. It is defended. The Islamic world, too, remembered Tours, though differently. To them, it was not a divine rebuke, but a lesson in overreach. They turned inward, channeling their strength into the arts, architecture, and science that would define the golden age of Islam. In that age, while Europe struggled to reclaim learning, Muslim scholars preserved and expanded it in medicine, astronomy, philosophy, and mathematics. Ironically, through translations and trade, Europe would later relearn from the very civilization it once feared. In this way, Tours was less a wall than a mirror, a place where two civilizations stared at each other, reflected in blood, and turned away to become what they were destined to be. The cross and the crescent did not destroy one another, they shaped each other. One birthed knights and cathedrals, the other scholars and cities of light. From conflict came contrast, and from contrast, civilization. Centuries later, when historians sought to name the battle, they would call it the Battle of Tours. But to some, it was the Battle of Poitiers. The very ambiguity of its name mirrored the uncertainty of its impact. What was clear, however, was that after Tours, Europe stood taller, aware of its fragility, but also its strength. In the candlelit halls of monasteries, scribes still wrote of it in trembling Latin, and there, by the will of the Almighty, the Franks stood firm, and the Lord scattered the enemy before them. Whether by will of man or will of God, it was enough. The world had changed. And though centuries have passed, The field of Tours remains quiet now, a plain of grass and forgotten bones. The wind still moves over it, carrying whispers of a time when destiny itself hung by a thread. You can almost hear it, if you listen closely, the sound of hooves in the fog, the clash of steel, the cry of men who stood when all else would have fallen. History remembers the victors, but legends remember why they fought. Not for conquest, not for faith alone, but for the right to endure, to hold their ground when the world demanded surrender. And that is the story of how 30,000 Franks stood against an empire, and in doing so, carved the future of Europe itself. Channel subscribe line for the ending voiceover, if you want to uncover more forgotten battles, lost empires, and dark chapters of human history. Make sure to subscribe and join us again, as we bring the shadows of the past back to light.